All right, so I didn't have you read any further on the Enlightenment in your main textbook, but based on History as a Faith, Chapter 10, and some reflections on Chapter 9, I really wanted to take a little bit of time to break down what the Enlightenment actually is, right? It's kind of the result or the outpouring of a number of movements all put together. And then the modern age. So understanding a modern worldview, understanding again how we ended up where we are today. And I think there's some really important influences and ideas that we need to share here. So here's some thoughts. First of all, as we're transitioning out of History as a Faith, Chapter 9, right, on the scientific revolution, the very end of the chapter, there was an argument that Wells made that he says Pandora's box has been opened. So Pandora's box, right? This idea, again, going back to Greek philosophy, that this box was given and so don't open it. Well, when it was opened, all the vices and sins and terrible things of the world were revealed, right? So it's problematic, and yet out of it also comes hope. So that's what opening Pandora's box means. And Wells is going to argue that the modern worldview was really an opening of Pandora's box, and it happened in three stages. First of all, he says, Renaissance humanism opened Pandora's box by questioning established authority. During the Renaissance, people were asking, could we trust the authorities, secular and religious authorities that are over us? The Reformation continued the pattern, right? So in the Reformation, what happened was people, Protestants, were questioning the authority of the religious authority of the Catholic Church, right? So truth or doctrine in some people's minds became much more relative, much more skeptical, and hard to be known, right? It encouraged skepticism. Some people were even going to ask, is there absolute universal truth at all? What can we really know is absolute, right? And as we said, it even splintered the formerly universal or united church, and we certainly see evidence of that today. And then the last one he argues that kind of opened and kind of pushes the book Pandora's box finally open is rationalism as a worldview. So he's developed as a worldview, offering a new secular hope for mankind. And he says this is the hallmark of modern thought. In other words, in the modern world, the main thing that everybody's living for and believes in is that through our efforts, through our reasoning, through our knowledge, through our education, we can save the world. We can fix it. We have hope for ourselves. We just think and try a little bit harder, right? So a new hope like in Star Wars. Conclusion, right, then of this kind of section here, and he says, this is according to Wells, the modern worldview was born. He says all modern systems of political, social, and economic institutions are based on the worldview of the Enlightenment. So we're going to ask ourselves here in a second, what is this Enlightenment we're referring to? That's the big questions. What was the Enlightenment? How would you define the modern age? Again, this was what we're trying to understand. In what ways does rationalism impact society, right? Or this enlightened way of thinking, politics, religion. And then we're going to kind of ask at the end the same question that Wells asked in History of Faith, Chapter 10. Is the Enlightenment actually a positive term? So defining the Enlightenment, and then again, just a handful of definitions are out there. It's a philosophical movement of the 18th century that emphasized the use of reason to scrutinize previously accepted doctrines and traditions, and that brought about many humanitarian reforms. That's not bad, right? Reform isn't necessarily bad. Or an 18th century philosophical movement stressing the importance of reason and the critical reappraisal of existing ideas and social institutions. So again, we see the questioning of authority, the importance of reason and rational thinking. Or a movement from around 1650 to 1800 that advocated the use of reason and individualism instead of tradition and established doctrine. The Enlightenment brought about many humanitarian reforms. Again, so the philosophers, the enlightened ones, right? Who were they? These are the activist philosophers, the natural scientists, and the writers who advocated the use of reason and common sense to reform institutions and social conduct in general. So they are going to write, they're going to think, they're going to process, they're going to have theories about society, they're going to tell people this is how things ought to be. Right? They're usually middle class critical thinkers. So why did the Enlightenment happen? When it did. We talked about already the Enlightenment, the Reformation, the Renaissance, but there was a number of other factors. First of all, right, the scientific revolution, Newtonian principles, this idea that we can understand the universe mathematically, and it kind of undermines, again, the personal God, the relationship with him. Not Newton himself, but the ideas that come from it. Great Britain was in a very stable position as far as wealth and prosperity to be pondering and thinking of ideas. France was in need of a lot of reforms, and so a lot of the ideas of the philosophers, especially related to politics, were based on needs for reform in the country. So we've got a problem, how do we fix it? And they're brainstorming and writing their ideas. Print culture was taking off, so people are not just writing books, and they're more accessible than ever, but you're getting newspapers and pamphlets available to share and spread ideas like never before in history. This is a big change. Right, and we said the Renaissance, the questioning of authority, the Reformation, all these things working together are what are going to give birth to the Enlightenment, which we'll see is going to have a huge impact on modern society. Right, so Voltaire, right, we're not going to mention many philosophers, but he's one that we have to, he's called the first among philosophers, and some say he's the most influential of them all. Some have called him the literary dictator of Europe. He authored a book called Candide, in which he attacked war. He attacked religious persecution. So he was observing all the conflicts between the Catholics and Protestants around him, and he says, this isn't good. And he had somewhat of a fairly unwarranted optimism about the human condition. So he actually is going to attack that. He's going to say, I don't think... He had a sense that humans were depraved, that there were problems there, and so he didn't have great confidence that mankind could just work everything out through reason, but he's going to get the ball rolling. In his philosophical dictionary, he argued or pointed out some biblical inconsistencies and the immorality of the heroes in the Bible, and he said, is this a book that is really worth trusting and reading and lifting up? Again, his ideas for reform, he said, according to your textbook, according to King, he says, it was not confident that reforms could be sustained. That's the Enlightenment, sunny outlook radiated more hopefulness, he felt, than certainty. So 2 questions right here. What were the goals of these philosophers, guys like Voltaire and others, and how would one define modern thinking? So according to Wells, right, he says the goal of the philosophers was to seek harmony and balance among men, just as the world is also balanced. What are the most natural political, social, and economic institutions? In other words, we want to understand the world around us. What is best? Is it most natural to have a king and a monarchy? Is it most natural to have democracy where everybody has a say? Is it most natural to have capitalism? All these different ideas are floating, and the philosophers, their goal was to come up with, say, this is what is natural and best for mankind. They wanted to liberate the human spirit. So, according to Wells, right, he says all truth in modern ways of thinking is universal. He says, according to the philosophers and others, denominations and sects were philosophically unacceptable. They couldn't all be right. And so, again, this is not postmodern thinking where it's overly relativistic. They're still believing in truth. They're trying to arrive at them. And he says what they sought, this is the philosophers, was a tolerant, morally useful religion that would unite, not separate all of mankind. Right, and so this is where we're going to get, again, the rise of deism or universalism. Let's just say that everybody's going to get to heaven or whatever they want in their own way. So one of the great hallmarks of the Enlightenment is the Encyclopedia, right? A couple different versions that came out, right? And Kagan argues, and Wells argues, that this was one of the great monuments of the Enlightenment. Different philosophers from all over France and Europe were writing and sharing these ideas. The encyclopedia itself, right, is from the Latin encyclios, which basically means an all-around education. So we're going to write and kind of inform you about all these different categories of life. They critique the government, right, different forms of government. They critique religion. They critique philosophy. And so you can imagine this is a pretty controversial book. Someone said it was an early humanist manifesto, right, where people are saying we're going to criticize the religious bodies and teachings of the day, and we're going to kind of trust our own ability to reason things out, right? Kagan, this is interesting, right? Again, Kagan's not writing necessarily from a Christian perspective. He says improvements in the human condition depended not on pleasing God, but on developing the earth's resources and living at peace with neighbors. The good life, he argued, was to be achieved by applying reason to human relationships. So the encyclopedia and all these writings of the different philosophers, their goal was to better understand, right, the world around them so that people or humankind could live the good life. And this is an important worldview term. Everybody wants to live what the good life is or what it ought to be. The problem is we all define it differently. So the Enlightenment and religion, right? A number of conflicts arise. First of all, a lot of the philosophers, as they looked at the church, guys like Voltaire and others, said, well, religious authoritarianism, this idea that, for example, papal infallibility or Pontifex Maximus, that the Pope is the supreme priest and he, what he says is always right. They felt like that was a hindrance to reason, science, and social improvement. Like Galileo would have been an example. They would say, well, Galileo was right. Science proves it. The church is against this. Why are we allowing religious authoritarianism to conflict with what is common sense and what is scientific and what seems actually to be correct? They accuse the church of a couple things. One, they marshaled a great deal of, and this is from Kagan, of historical evidence to support their argument that churches promoted intolerance and bigotry, and that quarrels over obscure points of doctrine turned religious enthusiasts into torturers and warmongers. Right? And before we say, well, that doesn't seem fair, well, look at what they were living through. Right? The philosophers are coming in the wake of not just the Reformation, but the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and all these conflicts where the differences of opinion led people to literally, instead of be super enthusiastic about their religion, really to be almost more passionate about fighting one another. It's a fair observation, one we've got to address. But they also, some of them, accuse Christians, and this is my kind of summary of it, of being so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. In other words, these Christians, right, they just think about the next life all the time, and they don't care about this world. They don't take care of nature. They don't take care of people. They don't care about others. And that's something as Christians we got to take seriously. Yes, we should have our mind on heaven. Our citizenship is in heaven. We're seated in the heavenlies. But we're here, and while we're here, we're supposed to be stewards of God's truth, to live as Christ, right, while we're here. So again, you have to ask yourself, and something to consider, how would you respond if you were accused of these things? Because you may be someday. One example of one of these kind of enlightened philosophers that was very critical of Christianity is a guy named David Hume. He said, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. Right? He said things like, which is more likely, that the whole natural order is suspended, or that a Jewish minx should tell a lie? And so again, he doesn't believe in the supernatural. He wants to explain everything very rationally. One quote by him that's kind of interesting and kind of shows that he still was thoughtful. The whole frame of nature bespeaks an intelligent author, though, he said, and no rational inquirer can, after serious reflection, suspend his belief a moment with regard to the primary principle of genuine theism and religion. So it's interesting, as much as he's counter-religion and against the church in some senses, he's kind of deistic in some ways too. But he says to explain the fact that we're here means there has to be an intelligent designer. So again, you see kind of the deistic worldview that's in between theism and atheism. So let's apply it in enlightened thinking not just to religion, but to politics and society. What overarching goals did secular enlightened humanists or the rationalists and the deists have for mankind? What were they trying to accomplish? Well, as Kagan argued, and Wells argues the same, they wanted to return society to its most natural state so that humans could enjoy the good life. So what does that look like when applied to politics or economics or the laws? And politics is what we're going to talk about for these next couple of slides here. Now going back, this is more even, this is the Reformation, Renaissance, late Renaissance period, but one of the guys that is going to argue somewhat scientifically, right, a guy named Thomas Hobbes, he was a writer, he was a philosopher, he was a scientist, he tests things out, but he, after all of his testing, argued for absolute authority, right? He says that a monarchy is the most natural or the best way to do things, and this is why. He believed, this is according to Kagan, he said the driving force behind human life is the quest to increase pleasure and minimize pain. Human beings, he said, have no spiritual ends and serve no great moral purpose. A sovereign commonwealth is all that prevents a society of egotists from tearing itself apart. In other words, right, in his understanding, mankind, if left to itself, he said, are self-centered beasts who are utterly without discipline unless it was imposed on them by force. If we didn't have a king, a strong central government or authority over us giving us laws, he says if were left to ourselves, we would literally destroy one another. Right? He argued that the dangers of anarchy, right, everybody can do what they want, were greater than the dangers of tyranny. And so he said the best form of government, the most natural for humankind, is absolute monarchy. Right, and if you're familiar with Calvin and Hobbes at all, here's a little comic here. It says, Hobbes, it seems the only time most people go outside is to walk to their cars. Here we have houses, electricity, plumbing, heat. Maybe we should We're so sheltered and comfortable that we've lost touch with the natural world and forgotten our place in it. Maybe we've lost our awe of nature. That's why I want to ask you, as a tiger, a wild animal close to nature, what do you think we're put on earth to do? What's our purpose in life? Why are we here? So you notice Calvin is asking worldview questions. And Hobbes, who is named after the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, right, and then shares his philosophy, says, we are here to devour each other alive. Because that's what Thomas Hobbes said in his philosophy we'd essentially do. And Calvin runs inside and says, let's turn on the light, turn up the heat. Doesn't want to be eaten, essentially. And again, so when you read comics, you see a reflection of worldview. You see these ideas being brought into the present day. So John Locke, writing not too long after, right, he's going to overlap a little bit with Thomas Hobbes, he is going to come from a little different perspective. He's going to say, I don't think absolute monarchy is the best way to do things. He believed that all men are created equal and independent, right? He added reason and goodwill to Hobbes' view of mankind's depravity. So whereas Hobbes says, left to ourselves, mankind is depraved, there's a problem, he said, yeah, but they do have goodwill, they do use reason, and if left to themselves and given, right, some directions and instructions, they don't have to, right, they'll make good decisions for themselves, or they can. Right, he argued that there's a social contract between the government and the government. So we've talked about this a little bit in the previous unit, that the king or the government has their responsibility, the people are responsible to submit to that as long as both are upholding their ends of the bargain. If one end breaks the deal, the other can break that social contract as well. I mean, his letter concerning toleration, he, right, not so different than Voltaire, argued that each individual is responsible for working out his or her own salvation. So again, he's more about being tolerant towards Protestants and Catholics alike. He had an interesting theory, right, of the blank slate, or it's described as tabula rasa. In his essay concerning understanding, he basically argued that all babies, right, mankind are born with a blank slate. We're not born with a specific worldview, that it's our environment and our nature, our nurture, our parents, everything influence and shape us into who we are. And so we could turn out good, we could turn out bad, all based on what's around us. Again, surely nature and nurture has huge impact on our personalities, environment, and things, but he doesn't necessarily take into account that depravity is a real thing, and you don't have to teach kids to sin. Again, that's John Locke. Now, another political philosopher who's kind of proposing a balanced view, kind of like John Locke's, is the Baron de Montesquieu. It's interesting. He wrote in The Spirit of the Laws that he said, you know what, some forms of government are good for certain places based on their background and their experience and their knowledge and their history and their culture, whereas a different form of government may be better in another. So he's very less absolute about kind of laws and rules. He says liberty is the right to do what the law permits. So wherever you live, follow the rules that are there. That's what true freedom is, right? And what we know most from him is the idea of checks and balances. So again, he's going to say we don't want any one governor, one individual having all the authority. We need people to check and balance them, right? So his ideal government would either be a reformed aristocracy, right? And so we've got a bunch of aristocrats or nobles that are reformed and are working together, or a limited monarchy. So again, very similar to John Locke's ideas. On the more extreme end, you're going to get Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he's the radical in some ways for his time, and a lot of his ideas are radical down to the present day, but he criticized materialism and economic freedom, arguing instead, right, and he actually writes about a social contract, right? John Locke argues for it, but he kind of just finds what it is, and he says, society, he would argue, is more important than individual members. Quote from Social Contract, it says, in truth, laws are always useful to those with possessions and harmful to those who have nothing. From which it follows that the social state is advantageous to men only when all possess something and none has too much. So he's saying, you know what, society, we shouldn't be trying to heap up wealth for one individual, unless the more equal and fair things are, in some senses, the better it's going to be for everybody. And the big idea that he kind of proposes, one of the really controversial ones, is the idea of the general will. And the general will, in summary, is that there is a best, or the general will, he argues, is the best, or the most natural thing, the most natural form of government, economics, culture, religion, etc., for the people in any one group or time, or related to any particular decision. And so he argues that, for example, if 60% of the population thinks that something is a good idea, then the other 40% needs to get in line and needs to be willing to go with that 60%. But there are times, he would argue, that the 40% are right.
And the 60%, even though the majority, aren't right about what's best for society. And in those cases, they might have to do something drastic to force the 60% to see what real freedom, what's most natural, what's best really is, what the actual general will is. The big question, right? And so he argues that this all leads to what is best for society is direct democracy. Let people have a say, they'll reason, and they'll figure it out. The question we have to ask ourselves is, who determines what the general will is? In other words, if you're part of the 40% or the 60%, you're both convinced that what you've decided or what you voted on is the general will, what's best for society. Well, if you think something's not the best, are you willing to fight? And to how far were you willing to fight to try to reach whatever it is? Right, couple quotes. Baron de Montesquieu said, when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty. So again, that's the idea of checks and balances. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he says, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, one of his most famous quotes. An idea says, yeah, they're born with it, but government and they're kind of captive to society and aren't given real freedom. So interesting, few quotes here real quick as we wrap up. The philosophers themselves are going to kind of evaluate the Enlightenment, and they didn't say, hey, here's the Enlightenment, what do you think of it? But as they're kind of reflecting on their reality and the world that they're living in and wrestling with what's best for society, they came up with some interesting thoughts and conclusions. The Baron de Montesquieu said, if we only wanted to be happy, it would be easy. But we want to be happier than other people, and that is almost always difficult since we think them happier than they are. Again, what he's saying here is, okay, we want to come up with the best, again, form of government, the best form of economics, or the best system to make everybody happy, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're all going to be happy because he noted, people are constantly comparing themselves to other people, and we have skewed views of the reality in the world that we live in. Right? Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract, he said, why should we build our happiness on the opinions of others when we can find it in our own hearts? He further said, everything is good as it comes from the hands of the maker of the world. So again, he's deistic in some ways, but he says, but degenerates once it gets into the hands of man. So even Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wanted direct democracy and wanted people that have a lot of autonomy, argues that when things and rules and laws are in man's hands, it usually ends up being problematic. He says, all my misfortunes come of having thought too well of my fellows. So as he got older, even Jean-Jacques Rousseau started to recognize that his faith in mankind, right, that he and John Locke and so many others had, might have been misplaced. Maybe they ought to have been more skeptical, like Thomas Hobbes was, of what mankind's spirit and personality was really like. Isaac Newton, though, he just says, I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, sure, but not the madness of people. So again, he says, from the scientific revolution, kind of his ideas kind of spur the Enlightenment in some ways. But he even said, look, I can understand math and how the universe works, but to understand people, that's a lot harder to accomplish. So evaluating the Enlightenment, right? Christianity versus rationalism. And rationalism, right, again, is that secular scientific kind of the worldview of the Enlightenment lived out. So whereas Christians offer a heavenly hope for mankind, rationalism is offering a secular hope for mankind. We want to make the world better, right, using our own brains. Ronald Wells in History of Faith argues, he says, with the increase of knowledge about nature and humankind, it would be possible, they argued, to progress to the highest of all stages of development here on Earth. And that was their goal. In other words, and this is a phrase you may have heard before, right knowledge leads to right action. People know the right thing to do, they'll do it. And this is in some ways, right, one of the underpinnings of the foundational beliefs of the Enlightenment, of the modern age, of the modern world that was born out of the scientific revolution, right? And what ways do we see that this has penetrated Christianity down to the present day? Well, we can see it at least in this sense, and this is a quote from Ronald Wells. He says, the church has not been the main line in the past 300 years, in the West at least. Thus we must ask, can we accept the modern world? And if not, what will we have to give up? So he says, it's evident now that the church is not, when people say, I need knowledge and information, they don't say, I go to the church. They go to science, they go to doctors, they go to scientists, they go to philosophers, scientific philosophers, but they don't actually go to the church anymore. Doesn't mean the church doesn't have an influence, but times have certainly changed. So we're kind of at the end here. We ask ourselves, is the Enlightenment a positive thing? is it Christian? Right? This movement that has for its worldview secular scientific humanism, a strong confidence in mankind's ability to reason things out for themselves, a distrust in the depravity of man. Basically says we're a blank slate, and kind of blame society for our issues. We need just to find the best way to create the good life, the best political system, the best economic system. Is that, and it undermines the authority of the church. Is that something that we can necessarily endorse? We certainly see its impact in the present day. But I don't want us to be afraid of the word enlightenment or to enlighten, right? Because really, enlightenment just means it infers that there's a period before it that's dark. And Paul, right, it's interesting, when he's writing his letter to the Ephesians, in his prayer for them, the King James, the Old English translation, which is again written right around this time period of the Enlightenment, says this in his prayer. He says, I pray that the eyes of your understanding would be enlightened. And so what is he wanting them to understand? He wants them to see and things to be clear, or more clear. First of all, he says, the hope of your calling. I want you to better understand. I'm praying that you would be enlightened and more aware of what great hope you have in Christ. Secondly, he says that you would be aware of the glorious riches of the inheritance that you have in Christ Jesus. I want you to grow in your understanding of what you have in Christ. And lastly, he says, I want you to grow and be enlightened as to the exceeding greatness of his power, Christ's power. He says, to us who believe, according to the working of his mighty power, which he wrought in Christ when he raised him up from the dead. Paul essentially says, I want you to understand that you have the power of Jesus Christ in you. It's so powerful that it raised Jesus from the dead. I want you to know that. I want you to own that. I want you to grow in your understanding of that, and that is his hope. So, enlightenment, right? Do we want to be enlightened? Absolutely, we do. Paul prayed for enlightenment, and my prayer for us is that this semester, this course, this class has helped to enlighten us a little bit more. It gives us greater insight into understanding why people think and act the way that they do today, based on what's happened in history. And in it all, may that be our prayer. My prayer for you is that you would grow in the knowledge of the hope that you have in Christ, of the inheritance that you have in Christ, and of the power of Christ that lives in you. Take care.